It was a chilly afternoon in the heart of the city, the kind of day when the breeze carries whispers of stories unfolding in the streets. The bustling crowd moved with purpose, heads down, lost in their own worlds. Among them, a man sat silently on the corner of Main and Pine, his tattered jacket pulled tight against the wind. His belongings, a worn-out duffel bag and a cardboard sign, lay beside him, unnoticed by most who walked by. He was invisible to the world, another face in the ever-growing population of those without a home. Or so it seemed. Officer Jenkins, a seasoned cop with a reputation that sparked debate among his colleagues, strolled down the street, his eyes scanning the crowd. To many, he was a figure of authority, but to others, especially those like the man on the corner, he was a symbol of fear. His stern expression, heavy boots, and the unmistakable air of authority he carried made people straighten up as he passed. Jenkins prided himself on maintaining order, but his methods often raised eyebrows and questions about the lines he was willing to cross. As he approached the man sitting in the corner, something in his demeanor shifted. Perhaps it was the sign, which read asterisk just need a hand, God bless. Asterisk, or maybe it was the way the man avoided eye contact, keeping his head down, as if bracing for yet another harsh interaction. Jenkins had seen it all before. He thought he could read people like an open book. To him, this was just another homeless man cluttering the streets, another situation to handle, another box to check on his list of daily duties. "Hey, you can't sit here," Jenkins barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the city. The man looked up slowly, his dark eyes meeting the officer's glare. He didn't say a word, just nodded slightly as he began to gather his belongings. But Jenkins wasn't satisfied with compliance. Something about the man's calmness irritated him, as if it was a silent defiance. "What's in the bag?" Jenkins demanded, stepping closer. The man froze, his hands clutching the strap of his duffel bag. "Nothing, officer," he replied, his voice steady but tired. That wasn't the answer Jenkins wanted to hear. Suspicion fueled his next move as he grabbed the man by the arm and yanked him to his feet. The sudden commotion caught the attention of nearby pedestrians. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs blending into the city's background noise. "What's going on?" One woman whispered to another. "I think that officer is harassing him," came the reply. Phones were pulled out, cameras recording every moment as Jenkins forcefully searched the man's belongings, his actions drawing gasps from the onlookers. "Stop resisting," Jenkins shouted, though the man wasn't moving. His calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate the officer further. "I'm not resisting," the man said quietly, his voice carrying an air of dignity that felt out of place for someone in such a situation. As the tension escalated, someone in the crowd spoke up. "Hey, leave him alone. He's not doing anything wrong." But Jenkins ignored the voices around him, focused solely on exerting his authority. He shoved the man against the wall, pulling out handcuffs. And then, amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. A black luxury car pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows slowly rolling down. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his face a mixture of anger and concern. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Jenkins glanced over, momentarily distracted. "Who are you?" he snapped. The man adjusted his tie, his gaze fixed on the officer. "I'm his attorney," he said coolly. And then, pointing to the man in cuffs, he added, "And you just made the biggest mistake of your career." The crowd fell silent, their attention shifting between the officer, the man in cuffs, and the well-dressed stranger. Jenkins hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. What was going on? Who was this man, really? The truth was about to unravel, and it would shock everyone, including Officer Jenkins himself. This wasn't just a homeless man on the corner. He wasn't who he appeared to be at all. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear that this encounter would change lives forever. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into this story. What happens next will leave you speechless. The officer's grip on the man's arm loosened slightly, his confidence shaken by the sudden appearance of the sharp-suited stranger. The tension in the air was palpable as murmurs rippled through the crowd. People leaned closer, phone still recording, eager to capture whatever was about to unfold. The attorney, unbothered by the prying eyes, stepped forward with calm authority, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. "I suggest you remove those cuffs immediately," the attorney said, his voice steady but firm. Jenkins bristled at the tone, his pride keeping him from backing down so easily. "And why would I do that?" he asked, his voice dripping with defiance. "This man is loitering, resisting, and I have reason to believe he's hiding something." The attorney's lips curved into a faint, almost pitying smile. "Hiding something?" he repeated. "Like what, officer? A crime? A threat to public safety? Or is it just his appearance that made you jump to conclusions?" His words hung in the air, cutting through Jenkins' bluster. The man in cuffs, still calm despite the escalating situation, finally spoke. "You don't need to do this," he said, his voice directed at Jenkins. His tone wasn't angry or pleading. It was steady, almost weary, as if this kind of encounter wasn't new to him. He shifted his gaze to the attorney. "You didn't have to come. I can handle this." The attorney shook his head, his expression softening as he addressed the man. "You shouldn't have to. Not anymore." Jenkins, feeling his authority slipping away in the face of this unexpected dynamic, decided to double down. "I don't care who you are," he said, directing his words at the attorney. "This man was sitting here with no ID, no explanation, and I'm doing my job. If you've got a problem with that, take it up with the precinct." The attorney reached into his inside pocket, pulling out a sleek black wallet. "I will," he said calmly, handing over a card. "But before you embarrass yourself further, I suggest you call the number on this card and ask for Mr. Donovan." The name seemed to spark a flicker of recognition in Jenkins, though he tried to mask it. His jaw tightened as he glanced at the card. But he didn't make a move to call. Instead, he looked back at the man in cuffs. "Fine," he said. "If you're so sure of yourself, let's go to the station and sort this out." He grabbed the man's arm again, but the attorney stepped between them. "You'll want to reconsider that," the attorney said, his voice low but firm. "Or do you really want to make headlines for arresting a man who has every right to be here?" The crowd, sensing a turning point, leaned in closer. Whispers of "who is he?" and "what's going on?" filled the air. The man in cuffs, whose name no one in the crowd yet knew, remained silent, his eyes scanning the faces around him. This wasn't how he had wanted his day to go. He had come to this corner for a reason, though not the one everyone assumed. He didn't care about the stares or the whispers. He had long since grown used to being judged based on appearances. But the look in Jenkins' eyes, the mix of anger and fear, reminded him of too many similar encounters. Encounters that often ended far worse than this one was likely to. As Jenkins hesitated, the man in the suit decided to press his advantage. "Let me make this simple for you, officer," he said. "You've just detained Marcus Gray. Maybe you've heard of him." Jenkins blinked, the name catching him off guard. He searched his memory, trying to place it. The crowd, too, began to murmur louder. The name rang a bell for some, though they couldn't quite figure out why. "That's right," the attorney continued, sensing the officer's confusion. "Marcus Gray. Philanthropist. Entrepreneur. And yes, millionaire. The man you're accusing of loitering is someone who's done more for this city than you can imagine." Jenkins' grip on the cuffs faltered. "That's ridiculous," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. "If he's who you say he is, why is he out here like this?" The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Marcus. "Do you want to tell them, or should I?" Marcus sighed, his calm demeanor finally cracking just slightly. "I'm here because I needed to see something for myself," he said, his voice quieter now. "To remind myself what it's like. What too many people go through every day." Jenkins frowned, still struggling to reconcile the man in front of him with the name and reputation that were beginning to click in his mind. "That doesn't make any sense," he said. "If you're so well off, why would you—" Marcus cut him off, his tone sharp. "Because it's easy to forget," he said. "When you've been where I've been, seen what I've seen, you know how fast things can change. I'm not just a name or a number in a bank account. I'm a person, just like everyone else you see on these streets. The crowd was silent now, their earlier curiosity giving way to something deeper. Marcus's words carried a weight that was hard to ignore. Even Jenkins seemed to feel it, though he wasn't ready to back down completely. "This doesn't change the fact that you are breaking the law," Jenkins said, though the fight in his voice was fading. Marcus looked him in the eye, his expression unreadable. "Was I?" he asked simply. "Or were you just looking for someone to blame?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The attorney, sensing that Jenkins had been backed into a corner, decided to step in once more. "Officer, you have a choice to make right now," he said. "You can double down on this mistake, or you can walk away and let us handle this privately. But I promise you, if you choose the first option, you'll regret it." Jenkins hesitated, his pride and his sense of duty warring within him. The crowd watched, waiting to see what he would do. And as the tension reached its peak, Marcus spoke again. "Let it go," he said quietly, addressing the attorney. "It's not worth it. I've made my point." But had he? And what point was that exactly? The crowd was left wondering, their curiosity growing with every passing second. Who was Marcus Gray, really? And why had he chosen to put himself in such a vulnerable position? The answers were coming, but not yet. For now, the mystery remained, leaving everyone, Jenkins, the attorney, and the crowd, hungry for the truth. Jenkins's grip on the cuffs lingered for a moment longer before he reluctantly reached for his keys. The click of the cuffs releasing echoed louder than it should have in the stillness of the crowd. Marcus rubbed his wrists but said nothing, his composure unwavering. Jenkins stepped back, his expression unreadable, but his body language screamed frustration. The attorney let out a small sigh of relief, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. He straightened his tie and turned to Marcus, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "You good?" he asked. Marcus nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He glanced around the crowd, their faces a mix of curiosity, concern, and judgment. He didn't blame them. To them, he was still just a man with a sign and a duffel bag, someone who had somehow managed to pull a lawyer out of thin air. Jenkins, still unwilling to back down completely, cleared his throat. "I'll be filing a report," he said, his voice low but laced with defiance. "This isn't over." The attorney turned to him, his calm demeanor intact. "File whatever you want," he replied. "But remember, officer, you don't just represent yourself. You represent the badge. Think carefully about what kind of story you want your name attached to." Jenkins didn't respond. Instead, he gave Marcus one last hard look before turning and walking away, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some shaking their heads, others still recording as they walked off. Marcus sat back down in the corner, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. The attorney crouched beside him, his tone softening. "Why do you put yourself through this?" he asked. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He leaned back against the wall, watching the traffic pass by, the city moving on as if nothing had happened. Finally he spoke. "Because they need to see it," he said. "People need to understand. Not just the ones walking by, but the ones who think they know everything. Like Jenkins." The attorney frowned. "You think he learned anything from this?" Marcus shrugged. "Maybe not today, but the seeds are planted. It's all I can do." The attorney was about to argue, but he stopped himself. He'd known Marcus long enough to understand that his mind was made up. Instead, he sat beside him, the two of them blending into the cityscape like any other pair of men having a quiet conversation. But the quiet didn't last long. Across the street, a woman in her mid-30s had stopped to watch the scene. She wore a bright yellow coat that stood out against the greyness of the city, her expression a mix of recognition and disbelief. She hesitated for a moment before crossing the street, her steps quick but cautious. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tentative. Are you Marcus Gray?" Marcus turned to her, his expression softening. "I am," he said simply. The woman's eyes widened, and she let out a small laugh of astonishment. "I thought it was you," she said. "I've seen your name on the foundation building downtown. I didn't expect to see you here like this." Marcus smiled faintly. "Not many people do," he said. She glanced at the attorney, then back at Marcus. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Your scholarship program, it helped me get through college. I wouldn't be where I am without it." Marcus nodded, his smile growing just a bit. "I'm glad it helped," he said. "What are you doing now?" "I'm a social worker," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I'm trying to give back, because of what you did for me." Marcus's expression softened further. "That's good to hear," he said. "The world needs more people like you." The woman hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but she seemed to sense that Marcus didn't want a big conversation. She thanked him again before walking away, her yellow coat disappearing into the crowd. The attorney watched her leave, then turned back to Marcus. "See, you're making a difference," he said. Marcus shook his head. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "There's still so much work to do." The attorney frowned. "You can't fix everything, Marcus. You've already done more than most people ever will." Marcus didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his thoughts far away. The attorney followed his line of sight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual ebb and flow of city life. "What is it?" he asked. Marcus finally looked at him, his expression serious. "I wasn't just here for the experience," he said. "I've been hearing things. Stories about people getting pushed out of these streets. Not just by the cops, but by people who should be helping them. I needed to see if it was true." The attorney's brow furrowed. "And," Marcus sighed, "I don't have all the answers yet, but something's not right. There's a reason so many people end up back here, no matter how much help they get. And I'm going to find out what it is." The attorney studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right," he said, "but next time maybe give me a heads up before you decide to go undercover." Marcus chuckled softly, the tension between them easing for a moment. "Noted," he said. But as the attorney stood to leave, Marcus's gaze returned to the streets, his mind already working through the pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet fully understand. Whatever was happening out here, he knew it was bigger than just him. And he wasn't about to walk away until he uncovered the truth. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. And as Marcus sat there, a man who didn't quite fit into the world of the homeless or the world of the wealthy, the story was far from over. As the evening shadows stretched across the city, Marcus remained seated on the corner, his mind spinning with questions and half-formed ideas. The streets grew quieter, but the rhythm of the city never fully stopped. Cars still honked in the distance, and the occasional passerby glanced at him curiously before moving on. Marcus barely noticed them. His focus was elsewhere, on the puzzle that had brought him here, on the patterns he couldn't quite piece together yet. The attorney had left an hour ago, reluctantly heading back to his office after extracting a promise from Marcus to call if anything went wrong. Marcus agreed, though he had no intention of leaving until he got what he came for. Something was happening here, and he was determined to figure out what. He had spent years building his fortune, then more years giving it away, trying to help people escape the cycles that trapped them. Yet no matter how much he did, the streets seemed fuller than ever, and the faces he saw here reminded him of his own past. As he sat there, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows, a man named Calvin, who Marcus had met years ago during his own time on the streets. Calvin was older now, his face weathered by time and hardship, but his sharp eyes and quick wit were still intact. He approached Marcus cautiously, his steps hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if the man sitting before him was the same young man he'd once shared meals with. "Marcus." Calvin's voice was hoarse, but filled with recognition. "Is that you?" Marcus looked up, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "Calvin," he said, standing to greet him. "It's been a long time." Calvin shook his head, letting out a low chuckle. "Man, I almost didn't recognize you. What are you doing back here?" You don't belong on this corner. Marcus gestured for him to sit. Maybe I don't, but I needed to be here. I'm trying to figure out what's going on in this area. People are disappearing, Calvin. Good people. They get off the streets for a while, and then they end up right back here. Or worse, they'd vanish altogether. Calvin's expression darkened, and he glanced around nervously before leaning in. You're not wrong, he said in a low voice. There's been talk. Some shelter managers, they're not what they seem. And some of the outreach workers, they're part of it too. They promise help, but they're just taking advantage. Marcus frowned. Taking advantage how? Calvin hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the frayed edge of his coat. They get people to sign up for programs, collect the money that's supposed to help them, and then cut them loose. Some of them even use threats to keep folks quiet. It's dirty, Marcus. Real dirty. The words hit Marcus hard. He had always believed in the power of community programs and shelters, pouring resources into them to create safe havens for people like Calvin. But if what Calvin was saying was true, then his efforts might have been fueling the very corruption he wanted to fight. Who's behind it? Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Calvin shook his head. Hard to say. They keep their hands clean, you know. But there's one guy, Big Rick. He runs a halfway house down on 9th Street. A lot of people say he's tied up in all of it. Marcus nodded, filing the name away. Thanks, Calvin, he said. You've helped more than you know. Calvin looked at him, a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. Be careful, Marcus, he said. You might have money now, but these people, they don't play fair. As Calvin disappeared back into the night, Marcus sat back down, his mind racing. If this was true, then the problem wasn't just systemic. It was personal. His own foundation had partnered with shelters like the one Calvin described, trusting that the funds were being used to help people. The thought that his money might be fueling exploitation made his stomach turn. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. A man in a dark jacket approached, his face obscured by the shadows. He stopped a few feet away, his posture tense. You Marcus Gray? The man asked, his voice low and gruff. Marcus studied him carefully before answering. Depends on who's asking. The man smirked, though there was no humor in it. Word is, you've been asking questions, poking around where you don't belong. Marcus stood, his height giving him an air of authority even in his casual clothes. And who says I don't belong? The man stepped closer, his face now visible under the dim streetlights. He was younger than Marcus had expected, but his eyes were cold and calculating. Let's just say, some people don't appreciate their business being messed with. You should walk away before you get yourself hurt. Marcus's heart pounded, but he kept his expression calm. If they're so worried, maybe they should clean up their business. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a glare. You don't know what you're dealing with. People like you think money and a name make you untouchable. But out here, that don't mean a thing. Marcus took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Maybe you're right, he said, his voice steady. But that doesn't mean I'll stop. The man stared at him for a long moment before backing away. Suit yourself, he said, but don't say I didn't warn you. As the man disappeared into the night, Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He was closer to the truth now, but the danger was real. Whatever was happening out here, it was bigger than he had imagined, and the people behind it weren't going to let him uncover their secrets without a fight. Marcus glanced down at his phone, his finger hovering over the attorney's number. He could call for help, bring in the authorities, and let someone else handle it. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. If he wanted real change, he'd have to face this head-on, no matter the cost. As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, the streetlights flickered above him, casting long shadows on the empty sidewalk. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for what was to come. And Marcus, standing alone in the quiet of the night, felt the gravity of the decision he had made. The air felt heavier as Marcus stood on the dimly lit sidewalk, the man's warning replaying in his mind. He had heard plenty of threats in his life. some empty, some not. But there was something about this one that stuck with him. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way they had been delivered, with a cold certainty that told him the stakes were higher than he had anticipated. He shook off the unease and began walking, blending into the flow of the city as if he were just another shadow. His destination was clear now, the halfway house on 9th Street. Calvin's words echoed in his mind, along with the name asterisk, Big Rick asterisk. Whoever this man was, he seemed to be at the center of the web Marcus was unraveling. The walk gave him time to think, though his thoughts offered little comfort. If what Calvin had said was true, then the corruption wasn't just limited to a few bad actors. It was systemic, entrenched in the very organizations meant to help. And if Big Rick was involved, it wasn't just about skimming funds or cutting corners. It was something darker. When Marcus reached the building, it looked unassuming, almost welcoming. The facade was freshly painted, with a sign that read, Hope Haven Transitional Center. A few people lingered outside, their faces wary but hopeful. To anyone passing by, it looked like a sanctuary. But Marcus had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. He approached the door, his pulse quickening. He hadn't planned on confronting anyone tonight, but something about the man's warning had pushed him into action. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. Inside, the building was clean and orderly, though there was an unsettling quietness to it. A receptionist sat behind a desk, her smile polite but strained. Marcus approached her, his demeanor calm but purposeful. Evening, he said, his voice steady. I'm looking for Rick. The woman's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced down at a clipboard before looking back at him. Do you have an appointment? She asked. No, Marcus said, meeting her gaze, but I think he'll want to see me. The woman hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. Marcus could feel her discomfort, but he didn't press. Instead, he let the weight of his presence speak for itself. Finally, she nodded and gestured toward a door at the end of the hall. Down there, she said quietly. Office on the right. Marcus thanked her and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The building felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. When he reached the office door, he paused for a moment before knocking. Come in, a voice called from the other side. Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside. The man behind the desk was large, his broad shoulders and thick arms giving him the appearance of someone who had spent a lifetime imposing his will on others. He looked up from a stack of papers, his expression unreadable. You Rick? Marcus asked, keeping his tone even. The man nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. Who's asking? Marcus Gray. Rick's eyes flickered with recognition, but he didn't let it show on his face. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from him. Have a seat, Mr. Gray. What brings you here? Marcus didn't sit. I've been hearing things about this place, he said. Things that don't add up. People disappearing. Funds being misused. Threats being made. I want to know what's going on. Rick chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. You've been hearing things, huh? From who? A couple of street rats with nothing better to do than make up stories. Marcus didn't flinch. From people who trust me. And from what I've seen so far, their stories hold up. Rick's expression darkened, and he stood, towering over the desk. You've got some nerve coming in here, throwing around accusations. This place helps people. Maybe you forgot what it's like out there, but not everyone has the luxury of playing hero from the comfort of a penthouse. Marcus stepped closer, meeting Rick's glare head-on. I know exactly what it's like out there, he said, his voice low but firm. That's why I'm here. Because I see the people you're supposed to be helping, and they're worse off than they were before they came through these doors. For a moment, neither man spoke, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Rick smirked, a dangerous glint in his eyes. You think you're going to come in here and fix everything, huh? You think your money and your name give you the right to judge me? It's not about judgment, Marcus said. It's about accountability. And if you're as innocent as you claim, you shouldn't have a problem with that. Rick's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. You don't know what you're getting into, he said quietly. This isn't just about me. You start pulling at this thread, and you'll find yourself tangled in something you can't handle. Marcus didn't waver. Maybe, he said, but I'm pulling anyway. Rick leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Then you better be ready for what comes next. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine, but he didn't let it show. He turned and walked out of the office, his steps measured and deliberate. As he exited the building, the night air hit him like a slap, sharp and bracing. He had gotten closer to the truth, but Rick's warning lingered in his mind. This wasn't just about one corrupt shelter or one dangerous man. It was bigger than that, much bigger. And as Marcus walked away from the halfway house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into the center of something far darker than he had imagined. The streetlights flickered above him, and in the distance, the city buzzed with its usual energy. But for Marcus, the night felt heavier than ever, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him with every step. Marcus didn't go home that night. Instead, he found himself wandering the streets, retracing his steps and reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. Rick's words gnawed at him. It wasn't just the threat. He'd faced threats before. It was the implication that this corruption wasn't an isolated incident, but part of something larger. If Rick was just a piece of the puzzle, then Marcus needed to find the rest before it was too late. He decided to call the attorney, even though it was well past midnight. The phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Marcus, what's going on? The attorney asked, his voice laced with concern. I need your help, Marcus said without preamble. I think I've uncovered something bigger than we thought. Can you meet me at my office? There was a pause before the attorney replied. All right, give me an hour. By the time they met, Marcus had already started digging through files and documents, his office a chaotic mix of papers and scribbled notes. He barely looked up as the attorney walked in, but the intensity in his expression spoke volumes. What did you find? The attorney asked, taking a seat across from him. Marcus pushed a stack of papers toward him. These are financial records from some of the shelters and halfway houses my foundation has partnered with. Look at the discrepancies. Funds being allocated but never accounted for. And here, payments made to third-party companies that don't seem to exist. The attorney frowned as he scanned the documents. This is serious, he said. If this is accurate, it's not just Rick skimming funds. It's a network. Marcus nodded. Exactly. And Rick's warning confirmed it. He all but admitted that he's just a cog of the machine. So, what's the plan? Marcus hesitated before answering. I'm going back to Rick's halfway house. If he's involved, then he knows more than he's letting on. I'm going to get him to talk. The attorney's eyes widened. Are you crazy? You saw how dangerous he is. If you push him too far. I don't have a choice, Marcus interrupted. This isn't just about me. It's about the people who are being exploited, the ones who don't have a voice. I can't walk away now. The attorney sighed but didn't argue further. All right, he said, but you're not going alone. I'll make a few calls and set up some backup. An hour later, Marcus found himself back outside the halfway house, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This time he wasn't alone. The attorney had arranged for a private investigator to accompany him, a no-nonsense woman named Carla who exuded quiet confidence. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The receptionist was gone, and the lights were dim, casting long shadows across the hallways. Marcus and Carla moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. When they reached Rick's office, Marcus knocked once before pushing the door open. Rick was there, sitting behind his desk as if he had been expecting them. His expression was calm, almost amused. Back so soon? He asked, leaning back in his chair. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. I know you're not working alone, he said. And I know this goes beyond just one shelter. Who's pulling the strings? Rick chuckled, shaking his head. You don't quit, do you? He said, but you're wasting your time. You're in way over your head. Marcus stepped closer, his voice firm. Maybe, but I'm not leaving until I get answers. Rick's amusement faded, replaced by a hard, calculating look. You want answers? Fine. He leaned forward, his tone deadly serious. You think this is about money? About some crook shelters taking advantage? It's bigger than that, Gray. This is about power. About controlling the system that keeps people like you on top and people like me in line. Before Marcus could respond, Carla stepped forward, her phone in hand. We've got everything we need, she said, her voice cold. Rick's eyes darted to her phone, and his expression twisted with rage. You think you can bring me down with a recording? He snarled, rising to his feet. Not just you, Carla said calmly. We're going after everyone involved. And trust me, Rick, there's nowhere for you to hide. For a moment, it seemed like Rick might lash out. But then his shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair. You have no idea what you've started, he said quietly. But fine. You want names? I'll give you names. Just remember, when this blows up in your face, you asked for it. He began listing off individuals and organizations, each name adding another layer to the web of corruption. Marcus and Carla listened intently, their determination unwavering. But just as Rick finished, the sound of sirens filled the air. Marcus exchanged a glance with Carla, their expressions both wary and triumphant. Looks like the cavalry's here, Carla said with a smirk. Rick glared at them, but he didn't resist as law enforcement officers entered the building, their presence commanding. As Rick was led away in handcuffs, Marcus felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. As they stepped outside, the attorney met them, his face a mixture of relief and pride. You did it, he said. Marcus shook his head. Not yet, he replied. This is just one piece of the puzzle. There's still more work to do. But as they walked away from the scene, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And when he checked his phone later that night, a single text message confirmed his suspicions. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. Marcus stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun.